The following scenario is hypothetical and presented for educational and entertainment purposes. Imagine waking up to a reality where the people you love have vanished without a single footprint in the snow. No doors forced open, no scattered belongings, just silence. So clean, so absolute that the brain refuses to accept it. The human mind is built on patterns. We survive because we assume causes follow effects, that events leave traces, that absence always has an explanation. But what if something enormous could exist without leaving one? That unsettling question is where our investigation begins, not with fossils, not with oceans, but with the human brain itself. When scientists discuss the prehistoric superpredator known as the Megalodon, the conversation normally ends quickly. It lived millions of years ago. It went extinct. Case closed. In textbooks, the creature is a solved equation, a chapter neatly closed somewhere around 3.6 million years ago. Yet the brain does something curious when confronted with certainty. It starts looking for cracks. Neurologists call this cognitive dissonance detection. When two pieces of information refuse to comfortably coexist, the mind keeps probing. In the case of Megalodon, the official narrative says extinction. But the ocean, our largest ecosystem, remains startlingly unexplored. Roughly 80% of it is still unmapped, unobserved, and biologically undocumented. If that statistic feels slightly unsettling, good. Your brain is reacting exactly the way evolution intended. Because while paleontologists confidently point to the fossil record, enormous serrated teeth the size of a human hand, vertebrae like dinner plates, another group of scientists focuses on a quieter question. Extinction is rarely neat. Species disappear through messy ecological collapses, habitat shifts, food chain disruptions. But the Megalodon wasn't just any species. It was, by conservative estimates, a 15 to 20 meter apex predator. A shark so large that modern great whites might look like its slightly embarrassing younger cousins at a family reunion. Its bite force could exceed 100,000 newtons, strong enough to crush whalebone like overcooked pasta. Creatures that dominate ecosystems don't usually vanish quietly. Their disappearance tends to leave ecological shockwaves. And yet the geological record around the time Megalodon supposedly vanished is strangely ambiguous. Marine mammal populations shifted, ocean temperatures fluctuated, entire migration patterns rewrote themselves. To the casual observer, this sounds like ordinary prehistoric climate change. But to a neuroscientist studying how humans interpret uncertainty, it's something else entirely. A perfect breeding ground for doubt. Because the human brain does not like empty spaces in a story. Give it a missing puzzle piece, and it will invent possibilities. Some logical, some ridiculous, and some just plausible enough to keep scientists awake at night. Which brings us to the first uncomfortable question that quietly circulates among marine biologists after conferences, once the microphones are off and the coffee has gone cold. If Megalodon truly disappeared, why do deep-sea ecosystems still behave as if something enormous is hunting there? At first glance, the deep ocean appears calm, almost boring. No crashing waves, no dramatic splashes, just a slow, silent world of drifting snow-like particles and bioluminescent creatures blinking like underwater stars. But oceanographers will tell you something unsettling. Calm surfaces can hide extremely chaotic systems beneath. In ecology, predator absence leaves fingerprints. When a top predator disappears, the food web reorganizes itself. Mid-level predators multiply. Prey populations explode or crash. Migration routes shift like traffic patterns in a city where all the traffic lights suddenly stop working. This phenomenon is known as a trophic cascade, and it is one of the most predictable patterns in biology. For example, when wolves were removed from certain ecosystems in North America during the 20th century, deer populations surged, vegetation collapsed, and entire landscapes changed shape. When wolves returned decades later, rivers literally altered their paths because plant life recovered. Predators, it turns out, are ecological architects. So if a creature the size of Megalodon truly vanished from Earth's oceans millions of years ago, We would expect the marine ecosystem to show dramatic restructuring at the same time, and to some degree it does, but not in the tidy way textbooks prefer. Paleontologists agree that during the late Pliocene, whale diversity changed significantly. Some species vanished, others grew larger, and migration behaviors began shifting toward colder waters. Climate change explains part of this, certainly. The oceans were cooling, ice ages were creeping closer. But when marine ecologists model predator removal scenarios, the results sometimes behave oddly. In certain simulations, removing Megalodon produces a ripple effect that doesn't fully match the fossil record. The numbers stabilize too quickly. Whale populations rebound faster than expected. Some prey species behave as though another large predator is still influencing their behavior. Of course, scientists usually chalk this up to incomplete data. After all, modeling ancient ecosystems is like trying to reconstruct a chess match when you only have half the pieces and someone spilled coffee on the board. Still, the anomalies exist, and anomalies have a way of irritating curious people. One marine biologist jokingly described the problem this way during a symposium. The ocean food web behaves like someone removed the king from the chessboard, but the other pieces are still playing as if the king might return. Everyone laughed, mostly, because the deeper we explore the ocean, the more uncomfortable another fact becomes. Our knowledge of large marine animals is surprisingly incomplete. In 1976, a deep-sea trawler hauled up something that stunned ichthyologists, a creature later identified as the megachasmid shark, or megamouth shark. It was over 5 meters long, massive, slow-moving, and no scientist had ever seen one before. A shark the size of a small bus had somehow lived in Earth's oceans completely unnoticed. Since that discovery, fewer than a few hundred have ever been observed, which forces scientists to accept an awkward truth. If a 5-meter shark can remain hidden for centuries, the ocean is clearly very good at keeping secrets. Now imagine scaling that secrecy up. Not 5 meters, not 10, 20, the size of a school bus with teeth. Naturally, most researchers dismiss the idea immediately. Large predators require huge amounts of food. They leave evidence, bite marks on prey, carcasses, bones. Something that big couldn't simply vanish into the depths unnoticed. At least, that's the official position. But there is one problem with that comforting argument. It assumes we are actually observing the deep ocean closely enough to notice. And according to recent oceanographic surveys, humans have visually explored less than 0.05% of the deep sea floor. To put that in perspective, we have mapped the surface of Mars in higher resolution than much of our own planet's ocean floor, which means the largest ecosystem on Earth is still, scientifically speaking, a dimly lit room where we've only peeked through the keyhole. And sometimes when researchers lower cameras into that darkness, they capture things they struggle to explain. Things that move too large, too fast, and disappear before anyone can be sure what they just saw. There is a moment every scientist experiences at least once in their career. It usually happens late at night, surrounded by data, when the numbers begin to whisper something that doesn't quite make sense. Not wrong, just uncomfortable. In marine science, one of those uncomfortable whispers comes from the deep-sea observation systems scattered across the world's oceans. Autonomous cameras, sonar buoys, and remote-operated vehicles drifting through darkness like robotic jellyfish. These instruments are not designed to hunt for monsters. They are built to measure temperature gradients, plankton blooms, and migratory patterns. Extremely boring things, scientifically speaking. The oceanographic equivalent of watching grass grow. And yet, every so often, something large moves through the frame. Usually, researchers shrug it off. A whale, a group of whales, a shadow. Sonar interference, equipment drift. Cameras are notoriously unreliable when suspended in black water thousands of meters deep, but occasionally the measurements become harder to dismiss. For instance, Passive acoustic monitoring, essentially underwater microphones, has recorded low-frequency disturbances that don't neatly match known marine animals. Now, before your brain jumps to dramatic conclusions, relax. The ocean is full of mysterious sounds, shifting ice shelves, submarine landslides, tectonic groans. Nature is noisy. However, in some cases, the recorded pressure signatures resemble something more biological. Large bodies displacing water quickly, like a massive organism accelerating through the water column. Marine physicists analyzing such signals usually land on the most logical answer. Large whales, sperm whales, blue whales, maybe even pods interacting in unusual ways, which is perfectly reasonable, except for one odd detail. Sometimes the movement patterns don't resemble whale behavior at all. Whales are air-breathing mammals. They follow predictable dive cycles. Even the deepest divers must surface eventually, and their acoustic signatures reflect that rhythm. Descend, hunt, ascend, breathe. But a few recordings suggest something different. Rapid vertical movements across depth ranges that whales rarely traverse in such short intervals. Again, this does not prove anything extraordinary. Ocean data is messy. Sensors glitch. Animals behave strangely all the time. Anyone who's ever owned a cat knows that biology occasionally abandons logic entirely. Still, anomalies persist. And here's where the psychological dimension becomes fascinating, because scientists are human. When confronted with ambiguous data, the brain naturally filters possibilities through prior knowledge. If you believe giant prehistoric sharks are extinct, you will interpret strange sonar readings as equipment artifacts or misidentified whales. Not because you are dishonest, but because the brain protects stability. Cognitive scientists call this confirmation bias, and it is incredibly powerful. It quietly shapes scientific consensus by guiding which explanations feel reasonable. Imagine, for a moment, that you are analyzing a sonar spike suggesting a fast-moving object roughly 15 meters long. Your options might include a misreading from overlapping whale signals, a drifting piece of equipment, an unusually behaving known species, or a surviving lineage of an apex predator believed extinct for millions of years. One of those explanations allows you to keep your grant funding. The others require rewriting marine biology textbook, so naturally the brain chooses the first option. Case closed. Except science has a habit of reopening closed cases. Consider the coelacanth, a prehistoric fish thought extinct for 66 million years, until a living specimen appeared in a South African fishing net in 1938. Paleontologists had confidently placed it in the Museum of Evolutionary History. Then one casually swam back into existence. Or the giant squid, once dismissed as exaggerated sailor folklore until deep-sea cameras finally captured one alive in 2004. The ocean has repeatedly demonstrated a peculiar sense of humor. Every time humans become absolutely certain about what cannot exist, something swims by to disagree. But before we let imagination run wild, there is a far more practical scientific problem with the idea of a surviving megalodon. Food. A predator that size would need an enormous caloric intake, possibly several tons of meat per week. Modern oceans simply don't support the same whale abundance that existed millions of years ago, which leads most marine ecologists to conclude, even if a few megalodons survived the extinction event, they couldn't sustain a viable population long term. Eventually, they would starve. End of mystery. Unless, of course, they didn't rely on the same food sources we think they did. And that possibility leads us into the first major turning point of this investigation, one that begins not with fossils or sonar, but with an unexpected discovery hiding in the bite marks of ancient whale bones. If you want to understand an ancient predator, you don't start with the predator, you start with the wounds it leaves behind. Paleontologists love bite marks the way detectives love fingerprints. Teeth are nature's signature tool, and when a creature with serrated blades the size of steak knives chomps into bone, it tends to leave very distinctive evidence. For decades, Megalodon's diet seemed straightforward. Fossilized whale bones from the Miocene and Pliocene periods show massive gouges matching the triangular teeth of this giant shark. Many skeletons reveal a consistent pattern: ribs crushed, flippers severed, vertebrae fractured. In other words, Megalodon hunted whales. A terrifying mental image, but scientifically tidy. Large predator meets large prey. The ocean food chain behaves exactly as expected. Then researchers started noticing something odd. Not all bite marks were equal. Some whale fossils show the classic Megalodon attack pattern: deep crushing damage consistent with a massive bite force targeting vital areas. But others show repeated slicing injuries across soft tissue zones, as if the predator was experimenting. It's a strange detail. Most apex predators evolve efficient kill strategies. Lions go for the throat, orcas flip sharks to induce paralysis. Nature favors techniques that conserve energy. But some Megalodon bite marks look messy, scattered, almost exploratory. This puzzled paleontologists until a few researchers began asking a question that initially sounded ridiculous. What if Megalodon wasn't just hunting whales? What if whales were the occasional luxury meal? Consider the metabolic problem again. A 15 to 20 meter predator would require immense energy intake. If it depended solely on large whales, its population size would always be limited by whale abundance. But the ocean offers another vast food source that humans tend to ignore because it's not very cinematic: the deep scattering layer. Every night, trillions of fish, squid, and small organisms migrate vertically through the water column in what is called the largest daily migration on Earth. This living cloud of biomass moves upward toward the surface after sunset, then sinks back into the depths before dawn. To sonar systems, it looks like a massive biological curtain rising and falling across the ocean. To a sufficiently large predator, it might look like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Now imagine a megalodon, or something evolutionarily related, taking advantage of this nightly migration. Instead of relying only on giant whales, it could feed opportunistically: large fish, squid, marine mammals when available. A flexible diet dramatically changes survival possibilities. Suddenly, the extinction model becomes less certain. Of course, this is still speculative. No modern megalodon has been observed. No contemporary tooth has been pulled from a fishing net. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, as scientists politely remind each other whenever someone gets too excited at conferences. But there is another clue that keeps the debate quietly alive: shark teeth. Unlike mammal bones, shark skeletons are mostly cartilage and rarely fossilized. Teeth, however, are constantly shed throughout a shark's life. A single large shark can lose thousands over decades. That's why megalodon teeth are relatively common in fossil deposits. But here's where things get interesting. Some ocean dredging operations have recovered shark teeth from deep-sea sediments that appear far younger than expected. Not fresh, nothing so dramatic, but preserved in layers that challenge neat extinction timelines. Most paleontologists attribute this to sediment mixing. Ocean floors are dynamic places. Currents shift layers around. Older fossils can migrate upward into younger deposits. A perfectly sensible explanation. Still, the dates sometimes sit uncomfortably close to the present, not millions of years, hundreds of thousands. In geological terms, that's practically yesterday afternoon. Does this mean megalodons survived longer than we think? Possibly. Evolutionary timelines are constantly being revised as new evidence appears. Does it mean one might still exist today? Almost certainly not. At least, that's the conclusion the majority of marine scientists confidently agree on. Because even if something that large did survive in the deep ocean, it would eventually have to come closer to the surface. And if it did, someone would see it, right? Well, that assumption holds up nicely, until you examine a handful of strange maritime reports scattered across the last century. Reports that most scientists dismiss immediately, but a few quietly keep copies of in their desk drawers. Most scientists do not enjoy discussing eyewitness reports. Not because scientists hate stories, quite the opposite. Humans are storytelling machines, but science survives on something more stubborn than stories. Repeatable evidence, measurements, specimens, data that can be tested by someone who wasn't there. Eyewitnesses, unfortunately, come with brains attached, and brains are notoriously unreliable recording devices. Psychologists have demonstrated that memory behaves less like a video camera and more like a creative writing exercise. We fill gaps, exaggerate scale, and unknowingly rewrite details every time we recall an event. A fish that was about this big gradually grows into a sea monster after a few enthusiastic retellings, which is why most marine biologists treat unusual sea creature sightings with the same polite skepticism reserved for ghost stories at a campfire. And yet, the ocean occasionally produces reports that are difficult to file neatly under drunk sailor imagination. One famous category involves what researchers informally call oversized shark encounters. These reports appear in scattered maritime logs throughout the 20th century. Fishing vessels describing unusually large dorsal fins, sonar readings suggesting massive moving objects beneath trawlers, or damaged nets that appear torn rather than bitten. Individually, none of these accounts prove anything. The ocean is full of large animals. Great white sharks can exceed 6 meters. Basking sharks can reach even larger sizes. A startled observer can easily misjudge scale when staring into dark water, but patterns sometimes emerge. In a few reports, crews described sharks significantly larger than known species, animals estimated at 12 meters or more. Again, eyewitness estimates are unreliable, especially when adrenaline is involved. A shadow passing beneath a boat can look twice its real size. Still, some marine researchers privately catalog these reports for an interesting reason. The descriptions occasionally contain details that match Megalodon anatomy surprisingly well. Not the exaggerated movie version, the realistic one. Witnesses sometimes describe an extremely broad head, a tall triangular dorsal fin set far back on the body, and a powerful tail movement that displaces enormous amounts of water. In a few cases, fishermen reported their sonar suddenly registering a massive moving shape that vanished seconds later. But the most intriguing element is not the size, it's the behavior. Large sharks, great whites, tiger sharks, are curious animals. They circle objects, they investigate boats, they sometimes bump things experimentally like scientists with teeth. But several of these mysterious sightings share the opposite pattern. The animal appears briefly, then disappears downward, fast, almost as if it had no interest in the surface world at all. This detail aligns with a hypothesis quietly discussed in some marine biology circles. If a lineage of giant sharks had somehow survived into the modern era, the only viable refuge would be the deep ocean, cold, dark, and largely untouched by humans. Down there, visibility is limited. Food chains behave differently, and encounters with humans become extremely rare. But such an environment would also force evolutionary changes. A surviving megalodon might not look exactly like the prehistoric giant we imagine. Over millions of years, natural selection could favor different traits. Perhaps slower metabolism, deeper diving ability, altered hunting strategies. In other words, if something like Megalodon still existed, we might not recognize it immediately. And that leads us to the final, slightly unsettling scientific conclusion. When researchers review all the evidence, the fossil record, ecological models, ocean exploration data, the overwhelming consensus remains the same. Megalodon is extinct. There is no definitive proof that it survived. But science, at its best, is not about absolute certainty. It is about probability. And when you consider that we have explored less than a fraction of Earth's oceans, when you remember that entire species the size of buses have remained hidden until recently, when you acknowledge that deep ecosystems still produce biological surprises every decade, the probability of a living megalodon may be extremely small, vanishingly small, but not quite zero, which means that somewhere in the darkest parts of the ocean tonight, Far below the reach of sunlight, drifting through cold, silent water, the food chain still obeys a very old rule. Something is always at the top, and we are not entirely sure what it is.